Hello there, this is me, Pulkita Huja, with second reading of the Discovery of India. So let's get started. Life's philosophy. 6 or 7 years ago, an American philosopher asked me to write an essay on my philosophy of life as a symposium he was preparing. It was attached to the idea, but I hesitated. And the more I thought over it, the more reluctant I grew. Ultimately, I did not write the essay. What was my philosophy of life? I did not know. Some years earlier, I would not have been so hesitant. There was a definiteness about my thinking and objectives then which has faded away since. The event of the past few years in India, China, Europe, and all over the world have been confusing, upsetting, and distressing. And the future had become vague and shadowy, and has lost the clearness of outline which it once possessed in my life. The doubts and difficulties about the fundamental matters did not come in my way in regards to immediate action, except that it blunted somewhat the sharp edges of that activity. No longer could I function as I did in my younger days, as an arrow flying automatically to the target of my choice, ignoring all else but that target. Yet I functioned for the urge to action was there, and the real or imagined coordination of the action, and the ideas I held. But a growing distaste of politics as I saw them seized me, and gradually my whole attitude to life seemed to undergo a transformation. The ideals and objectives of yesterday were still the ideals of today, but they had lost some of their luster, and even as one seemed to go towards them, they lost the shining beauty has warmed the heart and vitalizing the body. Evil trumped often enough, but what was far worse was the coarsing and distortion of what has seemed so right. Was human nature so essentially bad that it would take ages of training through suffering and misfortune before it could behave reasonably and raise man above the creatures of lust and violence and deceit as he now was? And meanwhile, was every effort to change it radically in the present or in the near future doomed to failure? Ends and means. Were they tied up inseparably, acting and reacting on each other? The wrong means distorting and sometimes even destroying the ends and views, but the right means might well be beyond the capability or infirm and selfish human nature. What then was one to do? Not to act was complete confession of failure and submission to evil. To act meant often enough a compromise with some form of that evil, with all the untoward consequences that each compromise results in. My early approach to life's problems have been more or less scientific, with something of the easy optimism of the science of the 19th and the earlier 20th century. A secure and comfortable existence and the energy and self-confidence I possessed increased that feeling of optimism. A kind of vague humanism appealed to me. Religion, as I saw in practice and accepted even by thinking mind, whether it was Hinduism or Islam or Buddhism or Christianity, did not attract me. It seemed to be closely associated with superstitious practices and dogmatic beliefs, and behind it laid a method of approach to life's problems which was certainly not that of science. There was an element of magic about it, an uncritical credulousness, a reliance on the supernatural. Yet it was obvious that religion has supplied some deeply felt inner need for human nature, and that the vast majority of the people all over the world could not do without some form of religious belief. It has produced fine types of men and women, as well as bigoted, narrow minded, cruel tyrants. It has given a set of values to human lives, and Th- Though some of these values are not applicable today or were even harmful, others were still the foundation of morality and ethics. In the wide sense of the word, religion dealt with uncharted region of human existence, uncharted, that is, by the scientific positive knowledge of the day. In a sense, it might be considered an extension of a knowledge known and charted region, though the method of science and religion were utterly unlike each other, and to a large extent they had to deal with different kind of medias. It was obvious that there was a vast unknown region all around us, and science, with its magnificent achievements, knew little enough about it, though it was making tentative approaches in that direction. Probably also the normal method of science, its dealing with the visible world and the processes of life, were not wholly adopted to the physical, the artistic, the spiritual, and other elements of invisible world. Life does not consist entirely of what we see and hear and feel. The visible world is which is undergoing change in time and space. It is continually touching an invisible world of others and possibly more stable or equally changeable elements. And no thinking person can ignore this invisible world. Science does not tell us much, of, or for the matter of that, anything about the purpose of life. It is now widening its boundaries that it may invade in the so called invisible world before long and help us to understand the purpose of life in its widest sense, or at least give us some glimpses which illuminates the problem of human existence. The old controversy between science and religion takes a new form: the application of scientific method to emotional and religious experience. Religions merges into mysticism and metaphysics and philosophy. There have been great mystics, attractive figures who cannot easily be disposed of as self-deluded fools. Yet, mystics, in a narrow sense of the word, irritates me. It appears to be vague and soft and flabby, not a religious discipline of a mind, but surrender of mental facilities of living in the sea of emotional experiences. The experience may lead occasionally to some insight into inner and less obvious processes, but it is also likely to lead to self delusion. Metaphysics and philosophy, or metaphysical philosophy, has a greater appeal to the mind. They require hard thinking and the application of logic and reasoning. Though this is necessarily based on some premises which are presumed to be self-evident, and yet which may or may not be true. All thinking persons, to a greater or a lesser degree, dabbles in metaphysics and philosophy, for not to do so is to ignore many of the aspects of the universe of ours. Some may feel more attracted to them than others, and the emphasis on them may vary in different ages. In the ancient world, both in Asia and Europe, all the emphasis was laid on the supremacy of the inward life over things external, and this inevitably led to metaphysics and philosophy. The modern man is wrapped up much more in those things external, and yet even he, in moments of crisis and mental trouble, often turns to philosophy and metaphysical speculation. Some urge or more precise philosophy of life we all have, though most of us accept unthinkably the general attitude which is characteristic of our generation and environment. Most of us accept also certain metaphysical conceptions as part of the faith in which have we have grown up. I have not been attracted towards metaphysics. In fact, I have had a certain distaste for a vague speculation, and yet I have sometimes found a certain intellectual fascination in trying to follow the rigid lines of metaphysical and philosophical thoughts of the ancients or the moderns. But I had never felt at ease there and have escaped from the spell with a feeling of relief. Especially, I'm interested in this world, in the life, not in some other world or the future world. Whether there is such a thing or as a soul, or whether there is a survival after death or not, I do not know. And important and and important as important as these questions are, they do not trouble me in the least. The environment in which I have grown up takes the soul, or rather atma, and the future life, the karma theory of cause and effect and reincarnation for granted. I have been affected by this, and so, in a sense, I am favorably disposed towards these assumptions. There might be a soul which survives the physical death of the body, and a theory of cause and effect governing life's actions seems reasonable, though it leads to obvious difficulties when one thinks of the ultimate cause. Presuming a soul, there appears to be some logic also in the theory of reincarnation. But I do not believe in any of these or other theories and assumptions as a matter of religious faith. They are just intellectual speculations in an unknown religion about which we know next to nothing. They do not affect my life, and whether they were proved right or wrong subsequently, they would make little difference to me. Spiritualism, with its seances and its so called manifestation of spirits, and the like, has always seemed to me a rather absurd and impertinent way of investigating psychic phenomena and the mysteries of the afterlife. Usually, it is something worse and is an exploration of the emotions of some overcredulous people who seek relief on escape from mental troubles. I do not deny the possibility of some of the psychic phenomena having a basis in truth, but the approach appears to me to be all wrong, and the conclusions drawn from the scrap and odd bits of evidences to be unjustified. Often, as I look at this world, I have a sense of mysteries of unknown depth, the urge to understand it, insofar as I can, comes to me, to be in tune with it and to experience it in the fullness. But the way to that understanding seems to me essentially the way of science, the way of objective approach. Though I realize that there can be no such thing as true objectiveness, if the subjective element is unavoidable and inevitable, it should be conditioned as far as possible by the scientific method. What the mysteri- what the mysterious is, I do not know. I do not call the God. I do not call it God because God has come to mean much that I do not believe in. I find myself incapable of thinking of a deity or of an unknown supreme power in anthropomorphic terms, and the fact that many people think so is continuously a source of surprise to me. Any idea of personal God seems very odd to me. Intellectually, I can appreciate to some aspect the concept of monism, and I have been attracted towards Advaita, non dualistic philosophy of the Vedantas. Though I do not presume to understand it in all its depth and intricacies, and I realize that merely an intellectual appreciation of such masters do not carry one far. At the same time, the Vedanta, as well as other similar approaches, rather frightens me with their vague, formless incursions into infinity. The diversity and fullness of nature stirs me and produces a harmony of the spirit. And I can imagine myself feeling at home with the old Indian or Greek pagan and pantheistic atmosphere, but minus the conception of God or gods that was attached to it. Some kind of ethical approach to life has a strong appeal to me, though it would be difficult for me to justify it logically. I have been attracted by Gandhi's stress on right means, and I think one of his greatest contribution to our public life has been this emphasis. The idea is by no means new, but the application of an ethical doctrine to large scale public activity was certainly novel. It is full of difficulties, and perhaps ends and means are not really inseparable but forms together one organic whole. In a world which thinks almost exclusively of ends and ignores means, this emphasis on means seems odd and remarkable. How far it has succeeded in India, I cannot say, but there is no doubt that it has created a deep and abiding impression on the minds of a large number of people. A study of Marx and Lenin produced a powerful effect on my mind and helped me to see history and current affairs in a new light. The long chain of history and of social development appears to have some meaning, some sequence, and future lost some of its obscurity. The practical achievements of the Soviet Union was also tremendously impressive. Often I disliked or did not understand some developments there, and it seemed to me it to be too closely concerned with the opportunism of the moment or the power politics of the day. But despite all these developments and possible distortion of the original passion for human betterment, I have no doubt that the Soviet Revolution has advanced society by great leaps and had lit a bright flame which could not be smothered, and that it has laid the foundations for the new civilization towards which the world could advance. I am too much of an individualist and believer in personal freedom to like overmuch regimentation. Yet it seemed to me obvious that in a complex social structure, individual freedom has to be limited, and perhaps the only way to read personal freedom was through some such limitations in the social sphere. The lesser liberty may often need limitation in the interest of larger freedom. Much in the Marxist philosophical outlook, I would accept without difficulty its monism and non duality of mind and matter, the dynamism of matter, uh, and the dialectic of continuous change by evolution as well as of leaps through actions and interactions, cause and effects, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. It did not satisfy me completely, nor did it answer all the questions in my mind. And almost unaware, a vague idealistic approach would creep into my mind, something rather akin to the Vedanta approach. It was not a difference between mind and matter, but rather of something that lays beyond the mind. Also, there was a background of ethics. I realized that the moral approach is a changing one and depends upon the growing mind and an advancing civilization. It is conditioned by the mental change of the age. Yet there was something more to it than that, creating basic urge which has a greater permanence. I did not like the frequent divorce in communist as in other practices between action and these basic urges or principles. So there was an odd mixture in my mind which I could not rationally explain or solve. There was a general tendency not to think too much of the fundamental questions, which appears to me beyond reach, but rather to concentrate on the problem of life, to understand in the narrower and more immediate sense what should be done and how. Whatever ultimate reality may be, and whatever we may grasp in its whole or in its parts, there certainly appears to be vast problems of increasing human knowledge. Even though this may be partly or largely subjective, and applying this to the advancement and betterment of human life and social organizations. There has been in the past, and there is to large extent even today, among some people, an absorption in finding an answer to the riddle of the universe. This leads them away from the individual and social problems of the day. And when they are unable to solve that riddle, they despair and turns to inaction and triviality, or find comfort in some dogmatic creed. Social evils, more of which are certainly capable of removal and attributed to original sins, just a second, attributed to originals sins to be unalterable of uh, where was social evils, most of which are certainly capable of removal, are attributed to original sins, to the unalterableness of human nature or the social structures, or in India, to the inevitable legacy of previous births. Thus, one drifts away from even an attempt to think rationally and scientifically and take refuge in irrationalism, superstition, and unreasonable and inequitable social prejudices and practices. It is true that even rational and scientific thoughts does not always take us as far as we would like to go. There is an infinite number of factors and relationships, all of which influence and determines events in various degrees. It is impossible to grasp all of them, but we can try to pick out the dominating forces at work, and by observing external material reality and by experimenting and practicing trial and error grope our way to ever widening knowledge and truth. For this purpose and within this limitation, the general Marxist approach, fitting in as it more or less does with the present state of scientific knowledge, seems to me to offer considerable help. But even accepting that approach, the consequence of the flow from it and the interpretation of past and present happening were by no means always clear. Marx's general approach of social development seems to have been remarkably correct, and yet many developments took place later which did not fit in with the outlook of an immediate future. Lenin successfully adopted the Marxism thesis to some of these subsequent developments, and again since then the further remarkable changes have taken place, the rise of fascism and Nazism and all that lay behind them. The very fast growth of technology and the practical application of vast development in scientific knowledge are now changing the world picture with an amazing rapidity, leading to a new problems. What so while I accept the fundamentals of the socialist theory, I did not trouble myself about its numerous inner controversies. I had little patience with leftist groups in India, spending much of their energies in mutual conflict and recrimination over fine points of doctrine which do not interest me at all. Life is too complicated and as far as we can understand in it our present state of knowledge, too illogical for it to be confirmed without the four corners of fixed doctrine. The real problem for me remains problem of individual and social life, of harmonious living, of a proper balancing of an individual's inner and outer life, of an adjustment of these relations between individuals and between groups, of a continuous becoming something better and higher, of social development, of the ceaseless adventure of man. In the solution of these problems, the way of observation and precise knowledge and deliberate reasoning according to the method of science must be followed. This method may not always be applicable in our quest of truth, for art and poetry and certain psychic experiences seem to belong to a different order of things and to elude the objective methods of science. Let us therefore not rule out intuition and other methods of sensing truth and reality. They are necessary even for the purposes of science, but always we must hold to our anchor of precise objective knowledge tested by reason, and even more so by experiment and practice. And always we must beware of losing ourselves in a sea of speculation unconnected with the day to day problems of life and the needs of men and women. A living philosophy must answer the problems of today. It may be that we of this modern age, who so pride ourselves on the achievements of our time, are prisoners of our age. Just as the ancients and the men and women of medieval times were prisoners of their respective ages, we may delude ourselves, as others have done before us, that our way of looking at things is the only right way leading to truth. We cannot escape from that prison or get rid entirely of that illusion, if illusion it is. Oh my God, I like this line. A living philosophy must always answer the problems of today. Yes, yet I'm convinced that the methods and approaches of science have revolutionized human life more than anything but else in the long course of history, and have opened doors and avenues of further and even more radical changes leading up to the very portal of what has long been considered the unknown. The technical achievements of science are obvious enough. Its capacity to transform an economy of scarcity into one of abundance is evident. Its invasion of many problems which has had so far been the monopoly of philosophy is becoming pronounced. Space time and the quantum theory utterly changed the picture of the physical world. More recently, researchers into the nature of matter, the structure of the atom, the transmission of the elements, and the transformation of electricity and light, either into the other, had carried human knowledge much further. Man no longer sees nature as something apart and distinct from him. Human destiny appears to become a part of nature's rhythmic energy. Huh. All of this upheaval of thought due to the advance of science has led scientists into a new region, verging on the metaphysical. They draw different and often contradictory conclusions. Some see it in a new unity, the antithesis of chance. Others, like Bertrand Russell, say academic philosophies ever since the time of Parmenides have believed the world is unity. The more fundamental of my beliefs is that this is rubbish. Or again, man is the product of cause which had no preversions of the end they were achieving. His origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his love and beliefs are but the outcomes of accidental collaboration of atoms. And yet the latest development in physics have gone long way to demonstrate the fundamental unity in nature. The belief that all things are made of single substance is as old as thought itself. But one ours is the generation which first of all in history is able to receive the unity of nature, not as baseless dogma or hopeless aspirations, but a principle of science based on proof as sharp and clear as anything which is known. Old old as this belief is in Asia and Europe, it is interesting to compare some of the latest conclusions of science with the fundamental ideas underlying the Advaitic Vedantic theory. This idea was that the universe is made of one substance, those form is perpetually changing, and further, that is the sum total of energies remaining always the same. Also, that the explanation of things are to be found within their own nature, and that no external being or existence are required to explain what is going on in the universe, which is corollary of a self-evolving universe. It does not very much matters to science what is the vague speculation leads to, for meanwhile it forges ahead in 100 directions in its own precise experimental way of observation, widening the bounds of the charted region of the knowledge, and changing human life in the process. Science may be on the verge of discovering vital mysteries which yet may yet elude it. Still, it will go on discovering Still, it will go along its appointed path, for which there is no end to its journey. Ignoring for the moment the why of the philosophy, sciences will go on asking how, and as it finds out, it gives greater content and meaning to life, and perhaps take us some way to answering the why. Or perhaps we cannot cross the barrier, and the mysterious will continue to remain mysterious, and life with all its changes will still remain a bundle of good and evil, a succession of conflict, a curious combination of incompatible and mutually hostile urges. Or again, perhaps the new progress of science, unconnected with and isolated with moral disciplines and ethical considerations, will lead to the concentration of power and the terrible instrument of destruction which it has made in the hands of evil and selfish man, seeking domination over others, and thus to the destruction of its own great achievements. Something of the kind we see happening now, and behind this war, which lies in the internal conflict of the spirits of man. How amazing is the spirit of a man! In spite of innumerable failing, man throughout the ages has sacrificed his life and all he held dear for an ideal, for truth, for faith, for country and honor. That ideal may change, but, that capacity for self sacrifice continues, and because of that, many may be forgotten to men, and it is impossible to lose hope for him. In the midst of disaster, he has not lost his dignity or his faith in the values he cherished. Playing of nature's mighty force less than a speck of dust in the vast universe, he had hurled defiance at the elemental power, and with his mind, cradles of revolution sought to master them. Whatever God there be, there is something godlike in men, as there is also something of the devil in him. The future is dark, uncertain, but we can see part of the way leading to it and can tread it with firm steps, remembering that nothing that can happen is likely to overcome the spirit of man, which has obsessed so much perils, remembering also that life, of all its evil, his joy, and his beauty, and that we can always wander, if we know how to, in the enchanted woods of nature. What else is wisdom? What of men's endeavor? Of God's high grace, so lovely and so great? To stand from fear set free, to breathe and wait, to hold a hand uplifted or hate, and shall not loveliness be loved of ever, the burden of the past. The 20 the 21st month of my imprisonment is well on the way. The moon waxes and wanes, and soon 2 years will have been completed. Another birthday will come round to remind me that I'm getting older. My last 4 birthdays I've spent in prison, here and in Dehradun jail, and many others in the course of my previous terms of imprisonment. I've lost count of their numbers. During all these months, I have often thought of writing, felt the urge of it, and at the same time a reluctance. My friends took it for granted that I would write and produce another book, and had done during previous term, as I have done during previous term of imprisonment. It has almost become an habit. Yet I did not write. There was a certain distaste of just throwing out the book which has no particular significance. It was easy enough to write, but to write something that was worthwhile was another matter, something that would not grow stale while I sat in prison with my manuscript and the world went on changing. I would not be writing for today or tomorrow, but for an unknown and possibly distant future. For whom would I write, and for when? Perhaps, perhaps what I wrote would never be published for the years I would spend in prison were likely to witness even greater conversion and conflict than the years of war that has already over. India herself might be in a battleground, or there might be civil commotions. And else, if we escape all these possible developments, it was a risky adventure to write now for the future date, when the problems of today might be dead and buried, and new problems arise in their place. I could not think of this world war as just another war, only bigger and greater. From the day it broke out, and even earlier, I was full of premonitions of vast and cataclysmic changes, of a new world arising, for better or for worse. What would my poor writing of a past and vanished age be worth then? All these thoughts troubled and restrained me, and behind them lay deeper questions in the recess of my mind to which I could find no easy answer. Similar thoughts and difficulties came to me during my last term of imprisonment from October 1940 to December 1941, mostly spent in my old cell in Dehradun jail, where 6 years earlier I have begun writing my autobiography. For 10 years there, I could not develop the mood for writing, and I spent my time in reading or in digging and playing about with soil and flowers. Ultimately, I did write. It was meant to be the continuation of my autobiography. For a few weeks, I wrote rapidly and continuously, but before my task was finished, I was suddenly discharged, long before the end of my 4 years term of imprisonment. It was fortunate that I had not finished what I had undertaken, for if I had done so, I might have been induced to send it to publishers. Looking at it now, I realize its little worth. How stale and uninteresting much of it seems. The incidents it deals with have lost all its importance and have become the debris of half forgotten past, covered over by the lava of subsequent volcanic eruption. I have lost interest in them. What stands out in my mind are personal experiences which have left their impress upon me. Contacts and with certain individuals and certain events, contacts with the crowds, the masses of the Indian people, in their infinite diversity and yet their amazing unity. Some adventures of the mind, waves and of unhappiness and the relief and joy that came from overcoming them, the exhilaration of the movement of action, and much of this one may not write. There is an intimacy about one's inner life, one's feelings and thoughts, which may not and cannot be conveyed to others. Yet those contacts, personal and impersonal, mean much. They affect the individual and mold him and change his reactions to life or his own country or to other nations. As in other prisons, here also in Ahmednagar Fort, I took to gardening and spent many hours daily, even when the sun was hot, in digging and preparing beds of flowers. The soil was very bad, stony, and full of debris and remains of previous building operations and even the ruins of ancient monuments. For this is the place of history, as of many a battles and places intrigued in the past. The history is not very old, as Indian history goes, nor is it very important in the large scheme of things. But one incident stands out and is still remembered: the courage of a beautiful woman, Chand Bibi, who defended this fort, and led her forces, sword in hand, against the imperial armies of Akbar. She was murdered by one of her own men. Digging in the unfortunate soil, we came across parts of ancient walls and tops of domes and buildings buried far underneath the surface of the ground. We could not go far as deep digging and archaeological exploration was not approved by authority, but did we have wherewithal to carry this on once we come across the lovely lotus carving of stones on the sides of the wall, probably over a doorway. I remember another and a less happy discovery in Dehradun jail. In the course of digging in my little yard 3 years ago, I came across a curious relic of past days. Deep under the surface of the ground, the remains of two ancient piles were uncovered, and we viewed them with some excitement. They were parts of the old gallows that have functioned 30 or 40 years ago. The jail has long ceased to be a place of execution, and all visible signs of the old gallows trees have been removed. We have discovered and uprooted its foundation, and all my fellow prisoners who have helped in this process rejoice that we have put away at last the things of ill omen. Now I have put away my spade and taken to the pen instead. Possibly, when I write now, will meet the same fate as my unfinished manuscript of Dehradun jail. I cannot write about the present so long as I am not free to experience in its thought action. It is the need for action in the present that brings it vividity to me, and then I can write about it with ease and a certain facility. In the prison, it is something vague, shadowy, something I cannot come to grip with or experience as the sensation of the moment. It ceases to be the present for me in any real sense of the word, and yet it is not the part either, and the past's immobility and statue calm. Nor can I assume the role of prophet and write about the future. My mind often thinks of it and tries to pierce its veil and clothe it in garment of my choice. But these are vain imaginings, and the future remains uncertain, unknown, and there is no assurance that it will not betray again our hopes and prove false to humanity's dreams. The past remains, but I cannot write academically of past events in the manner of historian or scholar. I have not the knowledge or equipment or training, nor do I possess the mood for the kind of work. The past oppresses me or fills me sometimes with its warmth when it touches on the present and becomes, as it were, an aspect of the living present. If it does not do so, they is cold, barren, lifeless, uninteresting. I can only write about it, as I have previously done, by bringing it in some relationship to our present day thoughts and activities, and then and this writing of history, as Goethe once said, brings some relief about the weights and burdens of the past. It is, as I suppose, a process similar to that of psychoanalysis, but applied to a race or to humanity instead of an individual. The burden of the past, the burden of both good and evil, is overpowering and sometimes suffocating, more especially for those of us who belong to very ancient civilizations like those of India and China. As Nietzsche said, not only the wisdom of centuries, also their madness breaketh out in us. Dangerous it is, or be an heir. What is my inheritance? To what am I an heir? To all the humanity has achieved during tens of thousands of years, to all that it has thought and felt and suffered and taken pleasure in, to the cities of triumph and its bitter agony of defeat, to the astonished adventures of man, which began so long ago and yet continued a beckoning to us, to all this and more in common with all men. But there is a special heritage for those of us of India, not an exclusive one, for none is exclusive, and all are called the race of men. One more especially applicable to us, something that is in our flesh and bloods and bones, and that has gone to make us what we are and what we are likely to be. It is the thought of this particular heritage and its application to the present that has long filled my mind, and it has about this that I should like to write thought, though the difficulty and complexity of subject appeals me, and I can only touch the surface of it, I cannot do justice to it. But in attempting it, I might be able to do some justice to myself by clearing my own mind and preparing it for the next stage of thought and action. Inevitably, my approach will often be personal one. How the ideas grew in my mind that shapes it today, how it influenced me and affects my actions. There will also be some entirely personal experiences which have nothing to do with the subject in its wider aspects, but which colored my mind and influenced my approach to the whole problem. Our judgments of countries and peoples are based on many factors, among them our personal contacts, if there have been any, have a marked influence. If we do not personally know the people of the country, we are apt to misjudge them even more than otherwise and to consider them entirely alien and different. In the case of our country, our personal contacts are innumerable, and though such contacts may picture or some kind of composite picture of our countrymen's form in our mind, so have filled the picture gallery of my mind. There are some portraits, vivid, lifelike, looking down upon me and reminding me of some of life's high points, and yet it all seems so long ago, and like some stories I have read, there are many other pictures round which are wrapped memories of old commanderships and the friendships that sweeten life. And there are innumerable pictures of masses, Indian men and women and children, all crowded together, looking up at me, and I trying to fathom about what lie behind those thousands of eyes of theirs. I shall begin the story with an entirely personal chapter, for this gives the clue to my mood in the month immediately following the period. I have written about towards the end of my biography, but this is not going to be another autobiography, though I'm afraid the personal elements will still be present. The World War goes on. Sitting here in Ahmednagar Fort, a prisoner, pre-forces inactive when the fierce activity consumes the world. I fret a little sometimes, and I think of the big things and brave ventures which have filled my mind these many years. I try to view the war impersonally as one would look at some elemental phenomena, some catastrophe of nature, a great earthquake or a flood. I do not succeed, of course, but there seems no other way that if I am to protect myself from too much hurt and hatred and excitement. And in this mighty manifestation of savage and destructive nature, my own troubles and self sink into insignificance. I remember the words of Gandhiji said on the fateful evening of August 8, 1942. We must look the world in the face with calm and clear eyes, even though the eyes of the world are bloodshot today. Okay, so that's it for today. See ya.